Welcome to r/Prorevenge, where an idiot gets himself arrested. Our next Reddit post is from Chapter 8. My uncle has always been a self-righteous, petty slimeball with a foul temper and a grandiose idea of his own importance, but little to no brains. My dad always just took it and tried to keep the peace because family is so important to him. This is the story of how my uncle finally pushed my dad too far and ended up getting arrested for his trouble. As background, my dad and uncle are neighbors in a rural community of 600 people. My dad built the house that my uncle lives in and sold it along with a small plot. So my dad's remaining land is about 6 acres and runs along the side and the back of my uncle's smaller property. My uncle is a dealer for HVAC units. My dad's in the HVAC business and would buy some things from his brother, even though his brother's prices were higher and he had more limited inventory than other dealers, in order to help his brother out. My dad also rented a building his brother owned and used it as his shop/office. He only rented the building and parking lot, but in the field out behind the shop, my uncle and my dad would both collect old HVAC units. These things were rusty and all around fugly, but when they didn't have anything else to do, they could go get one of these old units and break it down for scrap. One day, my dad went to his brother and said he needed a certain unit, but his brother quoted him a really high price and also couldn't deliver in the time frame that my dad needed. So my dad called up another dealer he works with, and that guy had a unit on hand to give him for a much lower price. It was a no-brainer. My uncle found out about this somehow. Dudes in the HVAC business are apparently like gossipy teenage girls, and confronted my dad, basically giving him an ultimatum that if my dad wouldn't commit to buying 100% of his units from my uncle, then my uncle wouldn't sell him anything. I already told you my uncle is an idiot. So my dad didn't say anything to his brother, but he took him at his word and stopped buying anything from him. A month or so later, my uncle showed up at my dad's shop and confronted him again, wanting to know why my dad hadn't ordered anything from him that month. When my dad told him why, my uncle exploded. They apparently had a screaming match, and in the end, my uncle announced that my dad was no longer his brother. They were no longer doing business together, and my dad was evicted from the shop. I will note that legally, my dad was not evicted because evicting him would have required a legal notice, a certain period of time, etc. But my dad was over it, so he said fine and began converting the barn at his house into his new shop. So my uncle, who apparently had thought that my dad would not call his bluff, showed back up at the shop a few days later and informed my dad that he also has to move all the old HVAC units scattered around the field behind the property, or he would sue my dad for the cost of removal. Now, this also probably had no legal power since my dad's lease was only on the building, not the field, and my uncle contributed to and used the old units as communal property. But when my dad is pissed off, he is really pissed off. So he agreed to move the old units. He took his tractor over and loaded each one onto his flatbed trailer, drove out behind his barn, and painstakingly arranged hundreds of rust bucket fugly old HVAC units an inch or two off the property line at the back of my uncle's house. Note that my dad couldn't see these ugly things from his house due to the way the property was set up, but my uncle had a high-definition view of them from his backyard. My uncle started being even more of a creep than usual and was always spying on my dad's house. So my dad decided to build a privacy fence down the side of his property that runs along my uncle's property. The fence guy arrived and worked for a few hours before my uncle came screeching into his driveway and exploded out of his truck, already screaming because these poor fence guys had laid posts or tools or whatever temporarily on his side of the property line as they were building the fence. My uncle called the police, who basically told the fence guys, "Okay dudes, just don't put anything on this crazy man's property," and they left. The next day, apparently someone left a hammer across the property line, so here comes my uncle screaming at them again. He called the police again, but by the time they got there, the guy had already moved his hammer. So the police were just annoyed by this point, but could only warn them not to do it again. Later that afternoon, my uncle called the cops a third time. I kid you not. This time, he wanted to report that my dad had stolen a backhoe from him, like one that attaches to the back of a tractor. One that, again, I kid you not, my uncle had given to my dad 2 years prior because my uncle didn't even have a tractor big enough to attach the thing to. The cop was not amused when the story came to light, and since it was the same cop who had been there earlier that day, she was beyond annoyed at that point. My dad helpfully said, "Come get the backhoe if you want it," knowing full well my uncle had no way to pick the thing up or haul it even the few feet to his own yard. My uncle replied that my dad was just trying to trap him and would say that he was trespassing if my uncle came onto his land, even though the cop was standing right there when my dad offered. And by the way, this conversation was taking place in my dad's driveway. He then said that he wanted to file a complaint with the police that basically amounts to a restraining order against my dad. The annoyed cop helpfully informed my dad that this would mean that even if my uncle texted or emailed him and invited him to come over to his house to discuss things, even if my dad had written proof that he'd been invited, that would mean that if my uncle called the cops or even took a picture of my dad on his property, he could potentially get arrested for trespassing. My dad said that he wanted to file one against his brother too. So my dad knew full well that his brother had no real clue where the property lines were and wasn't going to dig up his survey to check. So when my brother was away for a few days, my dad moved all the old HVAC units along the property line further onto his own property by a few feet. So he moved the property markers back the same distance. So basically, it looked the same as it had before, except it looked like the property line was a few feet farther back than it actually was. He then placed some random pieces of scrap along the fake property line, set up a few game cameras aimed at the line, and waited. Sure enough, his moron brother came storming out of his house as soon as he noticed the scrap on his side of the property line. Then he crossed the real property line to get a good look at the scrap and called the cops. My dad was waiting for them with his property survey showing where the actual property line was, as well as a copy of the report that the annoyed cop had given him and game camera footage of his brother clearly trespassing on his land. It was my uncle who got arrested. It was especially embarrassing for my uncle to be arrested by someone he knew well, and who could make sure that everyone else in town knew. OP adds some extra context in a comment. He says that his father was adopted, which is why he tolerated all of this stupid brother's BS because he was desperate for approval and love. But getting the uncle arrested was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back because the uncle said, "We aren't brothers" afterwards, which permanently damaged their relationship apparently. The sad thing is that OP's uncle is a real idiot. If he had just been kind and not so stupid, then they all could have gotten along. Our next Reddit post is from Wrecked Yoshi. I'd recently partnered with a small production facility in my area. Our contract was based on capital investment along with designing and implementing a new automation process. It was supposed to take us 2 years to finish, but we finished in 8 months. It was a typical small production facility comprised of 50 production workers through 2 shifts of 12 hours that ran 2 days on, 3 days off. They also had 2 production supervisors for each shift and 1 maintenance supervisor for each shift. Those people and their attitudes are ultimately what led to my decision to be more of an outside contractor for this company, until I worked the night shift for a week due to shutdowns that needed to occur to implement certain line upgrades. This is where I met him, Richard Head. Richard Head as in dickhead, I get it. Richard seemed like a nice guy in our first few encounters, and then I heard him in his element directing his maintenance crew at night over the radio. He would belittle this group of guys, unless something broke on the line, which would require attention first, obviously. I've never heard grown men spoken to like this, and I've never heard any nasty remarks back or defending themselves. He would call them stupid on the radio if they were having trouble troubleshooting a problem. Call them fat and lazy. He called a black guy the N-word. Richard had been there since they opened their doors, and to be honest, he made me want to rescind any commitment I've ever made to that company. When I escalated this up to the manager, he assured me that it was friendly banter and that they rarely had complaints against him. That was true because anyone who ever anonymously reported him was always outed and then singled out until they were terminated by him. Since no one was going to listen to me, I decided to do my due diligence and started to document everything I heard on the radio with a date and time, witnesses, and what rights the individual was having violated due to our state and federal outlines. I made this spreadsheet my entire time in the shift, documenting every personal account I witnessed as well. Harassment is a major problem with industry work, but the one thing that I've learned that's the company killer is retaliation. If you can prove that, then they stand no chance. I saw Richard one night tearing down this 50-year-old man who requested 2 days off to the point that I wanted to lose my cool, but I knew that it would ruin all the information I was gathering. The worker wanted his days off because his nephew was just in a car accident 2 days prior, and he had to have multiple reconstructive surgeries scheduled. I knew that now was the time to move on everything. I rounded up all the maintenance guys and shared all my documentation with them. They didn't realize the importance of this information like I had. They just said, nothing will change. Nothing changed because no one treats an issue as an issue if you come with incorrect, non-detailed information. The fact that he used the radio so much was a godsend that they didn't understand either. When he spoke this way to people, he must not have ever realized that there are other supervisors on shift, and that they, in fact, unintentionally became the strongest witnesses in the cases, especially when you have some audio recordings verifying the accounts. They had no choice but to acknowledge what they'd heard. Each worker took their logs, and even though I have money and time invested at this facility, I urged the workers at a minimum to petition to have this man removed or to threaten legal action. Once they coordinated a day to expose all this, it was like watching a sports movie when the underdog takes the championship and gets the girl at the same time. Not only did the man finally get fired, but the entire atmosphere around the place changed more than I could imagine. Older machines ran the best than they've ever ran in my time, and people loved coming to work again. They also put a placard on my door for when I came in about a week later. It said, "Number 1 boss." But the boss was crossed out, and hand engraved under it was the word badass. I obviously removed it from my door, but I put it in my home office, and it's probably the best thing that I've ever received from a facility. The one thing I never understand is why companies try so hard to protect toxic managers. Why would you want to have one happy manager who's a toxic, smug a-hole, and 50 unhappy workers who are actually doing all the work? Wouldn't it be much better to have 50 happy workers and then one unhappy management, or even better, one happy management? Or even better, everyone's happy and likes coming to work at your company. Our next Reddit story is from Top Desert Ace. So a while back, at my other job at an animal shelter, me and a couple of coworkers were talking, and one coworker mentioned that her son's car kept getting messed up in the student parking lot at the high school. So I asked why, and she said that apparently another student has it in their head that that one particular spot in the student parking lot is his, despite there never having been assigned parking at that school. Now, this kid, Steven, has a tow truck. Not even one of those big flatbed trucks. It's a little beater pickup with a tow hook in the back. If you've seen the movie Cars, think slightly bigger than Mater. Anyways, whenever someone parks in his spot, he then tows that person's car and parks in the aforementioned spot, usually damaging the vehicle in the process. Well, while my coworker was telling us this, I said, you know what would be funny? Parking the Bearcat in that spot and weighing it down. It would be effing hilarious to see that little turd try and tow that big chungus of a vehicle. The chief of police was chatting with us. The animal shelter in my hometown is considered part of the police department, and officers will occasionally visit us every once in a while. And he laughed and said, I would love to see that. The revenge. So, to start, the state that I live in, according to the laws, moving a vehicle a certain distance without the owner's consent and without proper towing permits is considered vehicle theft. I was told this story a few days later, so here's how it went down. The police chief placed a bait truck in the parking lot and set a couple undercover units close by, and the truck itself was weighed down with a lot of cement bags. Sure as anything, Steven shows up, sees the truck in his spot, and attempts to tow it away. Now, the plan was for the undercover cops to come out and arrest him right then and there. What happened was that Steven did a burnout trying to move the truck. Then, the back axle popped out of his tow truck. The undercovers came out and arrested Steven. The camera footage was obtained, which showed the roughly 100 other times he's done this, which, of course, only bumped up his charges. That was r/Prorevenge, and if you like this content, check out my podcast where I publish the exact same episodes. Also, hit that subscribe button because I put out new Reddit videos every single day.